Okay, in this short lecture, we're just going to discuss real quickly some non-sociological perspectives. Again, these are things that sometimes are, for us as sociologists, things that we have to kind of sort of quote unquote explain around. And sometimes we'll hear arguments against the things that we're talking about as sociologists from these various non-sociological philosophies. So let me just start by saying, and as we can see up here, sociology is based very much on a principle called determinism. Basically, fancy way of saying that we as sociologists, for the most part, decide that most human behavior is decided by social forces. The reasons that we act the way we act are because of things that have to do with the way society works. Okay, so again, from a sociological standpoint, that makes a lot of sense, right? So we are who we are largely because of the actions of social forces upon us. Especially when we think about things like, you know, um, the ways we're socialized as young children to be brought up, right, will largely determine a lot of our attitudes about things like, social phenomena. Again, there's clearly sometimes when sociologists have to make some determinations and exceptions, I should say, I'm sorry. But, for the most part, largely based on this idea that we are the people that we are because of social forces. This often flies up in some other philosophies. Free will, right, asserts that choices are voluntary. Like we decide how we behave because, and we decide to behave that way. It's not based on social forces. So you often hear, what did I have for breakfast today? Well, I could have had eggs or I had oatmeal, and I decided on the oatmeal. That's completely within, my free will, right? I determined what I wanted to have for breakfast, so that's why I did it. It's my choice. Okay? A sociologist will sometimes say, well, why were your choices eggs or oatmeal, right? Why didn't you eat beetles for breakfast? And somebody might say, well, there were no beetles in my house. And somebody would say, in another society where you've been raised your entire life to eat beetles for breakfast, then those social forces would have shaped that idea of, do I want this type of beetle or that type of beetle? It might still seem like free will, but we would say your choices are often limited by the way you were brought up in society in the first place. So there's this ongoing debate between free will and determinism. Again, Americans as a society, as a culture, tend to emphasize free will quite a bit. You are who you are because of your decisions, your actions, that kind of pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You are the product of, the decisions you make in society. So we do, as a culture, tend to really emphasize free will quite a bit. This often comes out in religion, in what we sometimes call Judeo-Christianity tradition, this idea of you are who you are because of the decisions you make and the ways that you decide to behave. And of course, sociologists will say, well, of course, a lot of that decisions that you have in the first place are limited by your place in the social structure. Whereas, most of the arguments being made from this, think about critical construction, which is talked about, are, often made by the elite who have lots of decisions to make. Right, and have the ability to make lots of decisions where we might say people in the lower classes, disadvantaged people, have many fewer choices and often sometimes describe themselves as, limited in what they can and can not decide to do, right? So there's definitely arguments against and for free will. Again, sociological explanations of a lot of social problems sometimes fly up in this idea of free will. So a sociologist may very well say, if we reduce poverty in the United States, that the prison population will drop, right? Because, and they can make a very rational argument about perhaps why, increasing people's, wealth in society or sharing more of the wealth in society will result in a drop in crime. And of course, the free will argument is people are still going to decide to commit crime no matter what. It doesn't matter how much wealth people have, or whether or not they're born into poverty or not. People are going to make the decision to do these types of crimes. So you can clearly see there's a very important struggle here. And then the other one that we sometimes talk about is this concept of human nature, right? Again, nature versus nurture. And again, if you've had me for intro to sociology or had this discussion probably in the context of talking about socialization, we know that sociologists definitely tend to fall more on the nurture section, right? We are who we are because of the ways we were raised, right? Determinism, as opposed to that's just the way things are. And whether or not you introduce this kind of a biological concept of human nature, instinct, those kind of things, or a religious aspect of that's the way God made people, or the gods, or whatever other divine power. But kind of this idea of human nature is that's just the way things are because of forces outside of social. So again, once again, sociology tends to lean more toward determinism, right? However, clearly, especially as we become more and more and more engrossed into issues of, like we said, gender identity, sexuality, and more and more and more acceptance being made for people are just born with a certain type of sexual attraction or affinity, right? So there's back and forth arguments on all three of these things. Just to make the note that in most cases, sociologists tend to rely more on determinism and less on these other arguments.